The move of grace following Genesis chapter 11 is where we'll go in the second hour. It's Abraham. Genesis 11 closes with human beings shaking their fists at God to build a monument to themselves, and they're scattered. And the movement of grace is chapter 12, verse 1. Abraham is called to be the father of a special nation of people who would be a light to all those nations, to call them back to God. Okay, here's what I want to do in lesson 2 to introduce the series. I want to tell you about, did I do the introduction? The introduction to lesson 2 basically is to say, maybe I'm the only one, but I grew up with a wrong-headed view of the Old Testament. I really had more of the pagan image of God in the Old Testament, the angry God. And God shows wrath in the Old Testament, but He shows wrath in the New Testament. God's character is perfect balance. God is holy, and a holy God has expectations. That's called law. Law is not bad. Paul says law is wonderful. Law is perfect. It shows us what God's ideal for us is. Law isn't bad. The problem is, if you try to justify yourself under the law and fix a system whereby, well, if I break this law, maybe if I do another good thing. No. Grace is God's answer to our violation of law. Law is God's plan A. Grace is what we need when we can't live up to plan A and must live at the reality level of plan B, that we're in a fallen, broken world and we're fallen, broken people. So, in the second lesson, before we go to the Abraham story around which everything else builds, I want to show you 2 stories out of the Old Testament that alternately confused and scared me and made me think that God was like the pagan gods. And I've had to repent of my image of God and try to change the image of God. I'll tell you some things incidentally that helped that. Grace wasn't discovered at the cross. And there were strains within Judaism that preserved a better reading of the Old Testament than Christians imposed on the Old Testament. Jewish people don't typically read the Old Testament the way Christians have read it. We've read it more in the tradition of Martin Luther than we've read it in the tradition of Jewish rabbis. Grace wasn't discovered at the cross. Grace is the theme of the Bible. And let me show you one of the places where that story is so obvious. David's great sin. You know the story. I won't spend much time on it because we have to compress things in these first 2 lessons. When the Jewish people got into their promised land after the Exodus and Moses leading them for 40 years and Joshua finally taking them into Jericho and into the land, They live for a period of time under the judges, and it doesn't work too well, and the people begin to clamor, and it's ultimately God's will that they have a theocracy, and there would be a king. And the people clamored for a king, and who did they choose? Saul. Why? He was tall, dark, and handsome. He could make good speeches. He could do good sound bites on TV. He was elected. Sort of. What kind of king did Saul turn out to be? Terrible. And so Yahweh informs the prophet Samuel. See, the people wanted this. Grace, God gives people what we want. You ever thought about that? Do I believe there's a hell? Absolutely. Do I believe there will be people there in eternity? Absolutely. And it'll be a gift of God's grace. By grace, God gives people what they insist on having. People who stand naked in their guilt and shame and ask for pardon, God gives it to them. The people who in their guilt and shame say, I'll show you God. I'd rather go to hell than live your way. He'll say, okay, I'll give you what you want. David's story. The people got what they want in Saul, but it wasn't what they needed. And when they began to realize what a terrible mistake they'd made, God approaches the prophet Samuel and says, Samuel, we've got to prepare for a better day for the people. This thing with Saul is going to continue to play out for a while. But go out to the house of Jesse, and he's got a bunch of boys, and trot them before you. And I'll tell you when the one gets there that I've chosen to be the king. And so he has the boys come in. Probably Jesse had them come in, maybe by age, maybe by the sense of the ones he thought would. It'll probably be this one. These would be my top three. I suspect. And so he runs through the whole lot of them. And what nod has Samuel gotten about any one of them? He's not here. So Samuel turns to Jesse and said, "You got any more boys?" He said, "Well, I got one kid, but he's out in the fields." And he said, "Bring him in." David comes in, this ruddy, young, sort of leathered-looking kid who isn't the tall, dark, handsome guy. He sees him, and God tells Samuel what? "There's my man. Because I look on the heart, not the outward appearance." Saul may be tall, dark, and handsome, but his heart's corrupt. These other boys, they're good boys. Jesse's done a good job with his kids, but this is the one I choose. Now, let me run all the way forward to Acts chapter 7 in the New Testament. David is called what? The man after God's own heart. Now, that's after this episode. That's the judgment of a New Testament prophet, Stephen. Well, the story. Springtime, the military campaign, the soldiers go out. King usually goes out. It was customary. The king's supposed to lead his troops. He didn't. He stayed home, had too much time on his hands. He'd run through all the Netflix and the DVDs that he had. And he's out on the balcony of the palace one day and he spies, whoa, look out. David's a married man. His wife is Michal, daughter of King Saul. Probably a marriage of political convenience and political alliance, but he has a wife. And David's the king. Kings pretty well do what they want to do. And it's sort of like a rock star or a professional athlete. They do what they want to do with impunity, they think. So David sends a runner and he says, "Tell the lady I'd just like to meet with her and have a conversation." Said, "Subject to my kingdom, king, I just don't have the conversation." And it winds up being a seduction. I hardly can blame Bathsheba. What woman has the power to resist the authority of a king? Yes, she sinned. It was adultery for her. She was married. But David is the seducer. David's the one who is the victimizer here. Basically raped the woman. And he thinks, "Oh, glad nobody's ever going to know about this. You go home, woman." A few weeks, month or two later, he gets a note from the house of Uriah, from Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, that what? "I'm expecting your baby." Had to be David's baby because her husband was out in the armies that David had sent out in the spring. He hadn't been home in months. So David fixes it. "I'll have Uriah brought home right quickly and he'll go home and he'll celebrate being here for 2 or 3 days with his wife. They'll make mad, passionate whoopee 2 or 3 times. And when the baby is born, he's going to say, 'Oh, boy, that was wonderful.'" Uriah has more principle than David. Brought home from the wars, he sleeps in the streets. Said, "My comrades in arms are out in the fields. I'm not going to take a shower and powder and sleep with my wife." So David says, "What? You didn't? Well, here, take this note to your commanders." He seals it up. He delivers it to the commander. He's a man of integrity. Though Uriah is mercenary in David's army, he's not even a Jew. He's Hittite. He has more integrity than the king of Israel, the man who will be a man after God's own heart, the man that God chose to be the king. Commander reads the orders. The orders are, put Uriah in the heat of the next battle and on a signal that everybody knows but him, pull back, leave him up there. I mean, I won't just keep tracing the story. David has seduced a woman. He's raped a woman. He's deceived her husband, murdered her husband, all the consequences that are going to flow out of that. And when the story is over, David divorces Michal and takes Bathsheba to be his wife. I used to be really, really concerned, still am, about the issue of divorce and remarriage because I was taught from the New Testament looking backward that, unless you're the pristine, innocent party in a divorce, you can't ever get married again. If you do, you're living in adultery. Well, here's David. He's going to be living in adultery. Michal disappears. She's never mentioned again in the biblical record. He takes Bathsheba to be his wife. She's not really his wife. They're living in adultery. He takes her in, begins to take care of her. The baby is going to be born. You read about some of the anxiety and angst he went through in 7 of the Psalms that he wrote about how bad it was during that period of time when he's wrestling with his conscience. He still had one. Prophet Nathan now comes in to David. And he says, Sire, if you have time, I'd like to tell you about a man in your kingdom. I just don't know what to do about this. Well, tell me about it. Rich man, flocks and herds. And he's got a neighbor, poor fellow. He's got one lamb that it's a pet, sleeps in the house with him. Doesn't even pen him in the yard. Well, the rich guy, he has a visitor to come and he wants to throw him a feast. Guess what he does? He doesn't kill one of his thousands of animals. He goes to the man next door who's got one little lamb that's a pet. And he steals that lamb away and he slaughters it and he serves it up and they feast her. David just becomes irate as that story is told. And he says, you tell me who that man is and he'll die. Anybody who do something like that doesn't have the right to live in my kingdom. What's Nathan say? Talking about you. You're the man. David's heart broke. Picking up the story how I left it off, Michal disappears. Bathsheba is taken into the house. She wasn't really his wife. Nathan calls her his wife, and he's the prophet of God. The woman that you have as your wife, you stole from Uriah. Bathsheba becomes the mother of the next king, Solomon. Not Michal's son, Absalom. Solomon. I would frankly tell you that confused me because it looks like there's more grace in the Old Testament than I was taught there is in the New. In the New Testament, if you marry poorly, make a wrong choice, do something evil to disrupt your marriage, the penalty is you have to be celibate for the rest of your life or go to hell. Under the Old Testament, you got grace. Looked like the New Testament was rigid and the Old Testament was showing people do mess up sometimes and it's terrible when they do and they pay a high price. But God does let them get on with their lives. That story confused me. Another story that confused me was the story of Nadab and Abihu. You know the story of Nadab and Abihu? Boy, that was the one that was told to us about, things like instrumental music and other subjects that you have to do things exactly by the law or God gets you, because the story of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10, Aaron is the first high priest of Israel after the nation is formed under Moses. And his sons are made priests. He has 4 of them. 2 of them, Nadab and Abihu. They're on service on a given day in Leviticus chapter 10. And they go and they offer strange fire before the Lord. And they are struck dead. And that story was told me, I'm sure Nadab and Abihu were good boys. They're the sons of Aaron. They're priests, after all. Priests were ordained by the authority of God. Don't know what happened that day, really. I guess they just, good boys, meaning to do well, got in a hurry, and they were careless. Strange fire. They probably lit their censers at the wrong altar. Instead of at the central altar, they probably, struck a match or used a lighter. But this just shows you. You break the rule, God strikes you dead. Let that be a lesson to you. And this and gopher wood and the other things tell you that if you don't have a command to do it, you'd sin if you did it some other way. Well, the problem with that was I didn't read the second half of the chapter. Don't know if you have or not. So in verse 8, they still have to have church that day. And you got to have priests to have church, to have tabernacle. And so Aaron calls in his other two boys, Eleazar and Ithamar. Any of you women are pregnant, you're looking for names, Eleazar, Ithamar. There's some really good ones back here. Probably not on the list that you're looking at of those old stale names like Bill and Bob and Rubel. But anyway, Eleazar and Ithamar. And he says, suit up, guys, purify yourselves, go through the ritual, put on the robes. And then Moses walks in, and Moses said, and let me warn you. You remember the mess that was made this morning. You remember how God struck them dead. So let me remind you how we are to do this today. And you do this, and this sacrifice is, and this is the sacrifice that once you put it up there, you take it off the altar and you eat it, and you don't leave anything to the morning, and da-da-da. Make sure you do it right. Yes, sir. The evening goes on, and they have the service. And Moses comes in, and he is horrified. Because what Moses discovers is, even though he had gone through with the priests exactly what was to happen, they had not done it right. Verse 16, when Moses inquired about the goat of the sin offering, this is after now, and found that it had been burned up, two kinds of sacrifices. One, you roast it and take it down and eat it. The other is you leave it to be burned to ashes. Moses said, let me remind you, this is the one you take down and eat. When Moses inquired about the goat of the sin offering and found that it had been burned up, they didn't roast it and take it down and eat it. They let it stay on there until it was reduced to ash. He was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and said, why didn't you eat the sin offering in the sanctuary area? It's most holy. It was given to you to take away the guilt of the community by making atonement for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not taken into the holy place, you should have eaten the goat in the sanctuary area as I commanded. As I commanded. They broke, if anything, who breaks the commandment of worship that day most clearly and obviously? Nadab and Abihu or Eleazar and Ithamar? Eleazar and Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu knew the rules, but Moses didn't rehearse it. Said, guys, now let's go through what we got to do today. But with Eleazar and Ithamar, he had walked through the details. Aaron replied to Moses, today they sacrifice their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, but such things as this have happened. Rehearsed what happened that morning. Two sons died. They're brothers. Would the Lord have been pleased if I had eaten the sin offering today? In other words, Moses said, you think I could eat after what I've gone through this morning? My two boys burned to a crisp and me having to go out and see their bodies put in the ground, or that Eleazar and Ithamar could eat? And so Moses is going to respond out of the heart of God and say, but that's the rule and you did it wrong, so bang, you're going to get nuked too. Well, I made that up. Verse 20, when Moses heard this, he was satisfied. And Eleazar and Ithamar officiated as priests for the rest of their lives. Something must have been going on there that was different from what I was told. A stickler God will get you if you miss something and do it wrong. Well, the latter part of the chapter, I think, explains what Nadab and Abihu did. Look at verse 8. Then the Lord said to Aaron, now this is between the two episodes I've related, Nadab and Abihu through verse 7, Eleazar, Ithamar later, struck dead on the spot. They break the rule, but even Moses gets it. Oh, I understand. And God showed them grace. I think you get the hint of what happened by reading verse 8. Then the Lord said to Aaron after the Nadab and Abihu episode, you and your sons are not to drink wine or other fermented drink when you go into the tent of meeting, or you'll die. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You must distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean, and teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord's given them through Moses. What was the strange fire of that day? It was the irreverent worship that two guys drunk as skunks offered going up to that holy altar to the Lord. They didn't make an innocent mistake. They didn't get in a hurry and, well, It's easier to light the fire here than there. They were snockered. Do you know that term? Here, also, they were drunk as skunks. Go back to that one. You apparently knew that. They were irreverent because they went in to officiate at the altar and they were drunk. If they had done it to the letter perfect, they'd have been struck dead. But when you're drunk as a skunk, you don't do it to the letter perfect. This sort of irreverence was not to be countenanced, and they were struck dead. And the fact that the issue at the end of their disobedience is about total abstinence from anything alcoholic on the day you serve tells me what happened and what made it strange fire. It was the strange mindset of the boys. That we can do what we want to. We don't have to honor God. Yes, there's a tension between law and grace. The law is do it this way. Grace allows persons who have violated law to be treated differently. Nadab and Abihu were given no grace because theirs was an act of deliberate rebellion. Eleazar and Ithamar were given grace because theirs was, shall we say, an understandable human reaction to a tragedy. David, Bathsheba marriages today. I'd like to say, my wife and I have been married 52 years. It's because we were so wise, mature, and clear about what marriage would be that we were 18 years old. I proposed to her the day I graduated from high school. She said yes. We set the wedding date for Thanksgiving. We didn't have to get married. We proposed to her in the spring. Set the wedding date for Thanksgiving. That's fall break at the Christian college I was going to attend. We got married on Thanksgiving. I said, let's get married on Thanksgiving. That was the week of fall break. But let's get married on Thanksgiving because you'll always remember our anniversary. It's the day you got your turkey. So help me. I said that to her. And she's never forgotten. We have not had a happy marriage with 3 children and 9 grandchildren because we were so mature, wise, and ready to get married. We were kids. And I know people who were much more mature than we were. Much better prepared to get married than we were. And who are people as committed to the Lord as we are. And who tried to do right, whose marriages have failed. I would say we're lucky and they are unlucky. I'd say human beings sometimes get it right and sometimes we don't. And divorce is like any other sin. Divorce is a sin. Divorce is adultery. Adultery is not what happens if a divorced person gets married. Divorce is adultery. Adultery means covenant breaking. It may or may not involve anything sexual. Maybe he beat her and she just had to leave to save her life. The covenant's broken. When the covenant marriage is broken, that's adultery. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 24, they could divorce and they could remarry. In the New Testament, we can't. Now, we've misread the text. God does not, whether it's David, the man who after all that's God's, is a man after God's own heart. Not because he sinned, but because of what? He couldn't be happy about it when he did it. Those 7 penitential psalms, David said, I didn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was as weak as bad coffee. Well, okay. I like mine strong. David is describing what sin does to a person with a conscience. But there's some people who don't have a conscience. In the New Testament, that's described as an unpardonable sin. To so suppress your conscience before God that you can't even acknowledge that what you've done is wrong. Nadab and Abihu were destroyed. Eleazar and Ithamar are spared. There's tension between law and grace, but God always comes down on the side of grace if there's evidence of penitence. The difference in Peter and Judas was not that one committed a worse sin than the other. Judas tried to fix his sin. He went out and hanged himself. When you sin, you don't take it onto yourself to fix it or to destroy yourself. Peter went back to the Lord and said, I'm not worthy. Feed my sheep. I can't. Peter, hush. I still got a place for you. Take it. Feed my sheep. And he shows up on Pentecost, the Holy Spirit. The difference was the heart of the man. Penitence allows grace. God values people over rules. The rules are real. And we're supposed to preach the Ten Commandments. We're supposed to preach the statements of law. There are not a lot of law statements in the Bible. Most of it's narrative. Most of it's story. But the stories are written against the background of, you know what God expects of you. That's what's called law. But the rule is not ultimate. God affirms hearts over rituals. And Jesus, we'll get to it later, says, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. What? Sabbath made for man. You weren't made to serve the rules. The reason God gave the rules was to give you some leisure, some space, some direction. Legalism says, no. Man was made for the Sabbath. Man is made for the rules that God is getting ready to spend. No. You're made to be an image bearer of God. And He gives law, He gives rules because this is the safe path to follow. But when you get off the path, God says, turn your heart back to me and I'll just be who I am. Now God's holy. He won't be trifled with. Nadab and Abihu found that out. So human responsibility is not eliminated. I am obligated to law, but I will not be saved by law. Paul says, with the keeping of law, nobody's ever going to be justified before God. Romans 3:20. But it does put our behaviors and misbehaviors in proper perspective. When we understand we can't be responsible enough and obedient enough that God's going to give us grace. We can be penitent enough, stand there in the naked self, admitting what we've done, and ask for mercy, and God will show it. So the conclusion is what I've already stated. We'll see Jesus say. The Sabbath was created for humans, not the other way around. Rules were made to help humans. Humans weren't made to serve rules. Law is holy. And Paul said that. Every commandment needs to be there, Paul said. Every commandment's holy and righteous. But he said, with the keeping of law, no flesh will be justified. Grace is greater, and grace is the need.